One for the Road, Chapter 3. The fringes of the city were haunting at night, especially as you approached Skid Row. The restaurants and retail stores of further neighborhoods gave way to run-down, earth-toned industrial buildings. Many lay abandoned, covered in graffiti, stripped of copper pipe and wire and packed with squatters. Trash begins to accumulate, first in the gutters, then onto the sidewalk in impassable piles, as if the sanitation department had completely abandoned the area. Here and there, the odd fire. People stood around on corners, drinking, smoking meth, talking to themselves. And all this before you even broke into the 50 or so square blocks that actually comprised the row. It was a 50-block blind spot, willfully blind, but blind nonetheless. It was where people who fell through society's gaps were collected and left there to live in squalor. They were encouraged to migrate there. In the old days, they had even been forced to. Dealt a beating and dumped there by the police. Ben wondered what all the tourists would think if those double-decker sightseeing buses took a trip this way. They wouldn't have to stray far to see it. There were homeless all over the city in scores, sure, but here it was different. This corner belonged to them. He imagined it must be what a refugee camp or war-torn village looked and felt like. He had passed several hotels that were in abysmal condition even by the low standard of Skid Row flop houses. His mother once told him that at some of these places the employees would come into your room and rob you at night, knowing you had little recourse. He made his way to the Royal Inn, a place they had stayed several times that wasn't too bad. It was relatively far from the heart of the row, and the attendants there were quick to call the cops when they caught a whiff of illegal activity. That was probably why it was now closed and shuttered. Shit, he muttered aloud. Anxiety was beginning to grow in the pit of his belly. If he didn't find a decent place soon, he knew that he would have to settle for any flea-ridden one he could find. Tweakers, strange smells, stains, and all. He was beginning to feel unsafe on the street and painfully alone. More and more people were populating the sidewalk and zipping around on makeshift motorbikes and scooters. More and more of them were clearly on drugs, drunk, or somehow disassociated from reality. Fires started from pallets and garbage dotted the sidewalks. Some tame bonfires with people huddled around them for warmth. Most raging infernos quickly growing out of control. What made people burn things, he wondered. On cold nights it was mostly survival, but even during sweltering summer days it was not uncommon to see these fires. He paused in front of an alleyway and looked around, partly to survey his surroundings. It was always smart to keep your head on a swivel, especially at night, but also to take a calming breath and choose a new direction to continue his search in. He knew there weren't any more hotels if he kept going west. At least not the kind he needed. So he decided to head southeast, thinking there would be the most options in that area. That was when he heard the growl. He whipped around to face the dark mouth of the alley, startled by the sudden sound of something unseen. The growl continued and was growing closer. For a moment, his mind assembled the silhouette of some terrible beast skulking toward him out of the darkness. It's just a stray dog, and you're probably disturbing its sleep, he reassured himself. The yellow eyes he now saw hanging low in the dark were clearly canine. He breathed easier. Stray dogs could still be vicious, but it was no monster. Ben squatted and with one open hand outstretched toward the eyes, he calmly whispered, "It's okay, buddy. I didn't mean to bother you. I'll be on my way now." He could hear the scraping of claws on the asphalt as the dog drew closer and its shape became distinguishable in the shadow. It was no longer growling. Instead, it was whimpering, its head bowed low as it finally stepped out of the shadows and fully into view. He was a mutt of some kind, a lab, and a handful of other breeds, judging by the look. He was completely black, except for a cross-shaped splotch of white fur adorning his chest and those piercing, almost golden eyes. If the dog had been well groomed and cared for, he would probably be a stunningly handsome animal. There was a bite out of his left ear and a nasty-looking scratch across the right side of his ribs. His muzzle was wet with blood. "Looks like you got in a pretty bad scrap, huh?" Even the dogs here had a rough go of things, it would seem. The dog seemed to stare at him with an odd look of what may have been comprehension. "You're not gonna bite me, are you? If I try to pat you up?" he asked. The dog only continued staring, cocking his head to one side momentarily, as if to hear. "Okay, come here then." Luckily, he had grabbed a small first aid kit from his things at camp. First, he sprayed the wounds with antiseptic. He read somewhere that dog saliva killed bacteria and that was why they licked their wounds, but figured it couldn't hurt. The dog let out a small yelp and a snarl, but turned his head away from Ben's as if to assure him that he knew the boy was helping him and would not bite. Next, he wrapped several layers of gauze around the dog's torso. The scratches were deep, but they had already begun to scab. He thought they would heal if they didn't get infected. When it was done, the dog sat proudly, looking up at him with his neck outstretched and chest forward. He looked almost regal, despite his filth and mange. The eyes were thankful. He gave him a good pat on the head, careful to avoid the injured ear. "I think I'll call you Royal, if you decide to hang around." The dog wagged his tail happily and let out a small bark, apparently in approval. They headed southeast together, the dog close at Ben's heels. He felt a great deal safer now, although he wasn't sure how much good this injured stray would do in way of protection. He hoped people would rather not mess with a large dog to begin with. Along the way, they shared one of Ben's granola bars, him occasionally breaking a piece off and throwing it to the dog. Never missed a catch. He'd always wanted a dog. That had been another piece of normalcy denied to him. It was hard to have a dog with such a nomadic lifestyle. It wasn't fair to the dog, his mother had said. She was probably right. They passed a few more hotels, but each had a handful of unsavory-looking people outside, either shooting up or smoking something. He gave them a wide berth. He was almost at the point of giving up, deciding whether to head back to one of the junkie dens when he rounded the corner and saw it. An old building, recently painted black with shiny gold trim and accents, stood in the center of the street, surrounded by shuttered warehouses and storefronts. It was apparently the only place still in business on this block, which wasn't uncommon. Spotlights shone down from beneath the first row of windows, bathing the sidewalk in light and accentuating the details and ridges of the architecture. An awning jutted out from above the entryway, bearing the words Castle Carlisle in golden Art Deco font, illuminated by their own spotlights. It almost looked like something out of The Great Gatsby. It stood in stark contrast to its surroundings. For a moment, he wondered if gentrification had crept its way this deep and hoped it hadn't. He needed this place to be affordable, accept cash, and ask few questions. He shuddered to think of the alternative. Beneath the awning, a tall, thin man in a black dress shirt, slacks, and loafers was diligently sweeping the sidewalk, although there was no litter within 100 feet of the hotel on either side. It might have been the cleanest street in Los Angeles. Ben was struck by the lack of tents and pallet shacks as well, and this also raised his doubts. Another sign of gentrification. There was no harm in trying his luck, though, so he pressed forward. Royal moved with apprehension as they drew closer, his head low and tail tucked, trailing a foot or so behind and occasionally stopping to look back the way they had come. "Good evening, young man," the sweeping man said as Ben approached, never stopping the motion of the broom even as he looked up to make eye contact. Close up, the man was even taller than he had thought. Maybe 6'3" or more, and almost unhealthily thin. His face was pale and gaunt. A thin, well-trimmed goatee accentuated the lines of his sucked-in cheeks like a shadow. Royal was pacing anxiously now behind Ben, although he didn't notice. "How's it going? You work here?" He pointed at the hotel. "No, I just have a habit of sweeping filthy sidewalks." The tone was matter of fact, but he wore a slight sarcastic smirk. "Right, that was a stupid question." His face felt warm. "There are no stupid questions, Ben. Only ones that shouldn't be asked. I am Curtis Burke. Pleased to meet you. I wear many hats at this establishment." "Nice to meet you, Curtis. Do you have any vacancy?" And then, with considerable shame, "And do you guys take cash?" "Yes, and yes." Royal began to growl. A deep guttural sound that seemed impossible for anything called man's best friend to produce. It was much more threatening than what Ben had heard in the alley, and it startled him once again. "Hey, it's okay, buddy. Don't be rude." He reached to pet the dog, but he pulled away, his golden eyes never leaving the tall attendant. Curtis was glaring at the dog with something that looked like contempt. He backed away several steps. "I'm sorry, but no dogs are allowed on the premises. Fleas, ticks, bedbugs, I'm sure you understand. Hopefully that won't be a problem." "No, not a problem. He's a stray. I just found him. I'm sure I'll be fine sleeping outside one more night." Ben didn't want to leave the dog behind, but he hoped desperately that he waited for him until morning. "Indeed." There was disdain in his voice, and he was still glaring at Royal. "Come along, then." "I can't bring you in there, boy. I'm sorry. Please wait for me. We'll figure things out in the morning." He scratched the dog on his head, fearing he would likely never see him again, and turned to follow Curtis into the lobby. Royal barked after him pitifully as he went. The lobby was unlike any he had ever seen, more akin to that of a proper hotel than a flophouse. The floor was stone, maybe marble, although he thought that was impossible, with an alternating black and white diamond pattern. The walls were a kind of dull matte black adorned with intricate gold picture frame molding, and not tacky hardware store gold paint. Ben was fairly sure it was actual gold leaf. Two massive crystal chandeliers, one above the lounge area and one above the entryway, commanded the room and cast a warm, calming light throughout. He could not believe his eyes. There were no stains nor filth, no junkies to be seen. Only one man with neat, slicked-back black hair, wearing a clean black t-shirt and nursing a drink in the lounge. Ben felt painfully out of place here, but the attendant had said they took cash. There weren't luxury cash hotels now, were there? When Curtis was settled behind the reception desk, he informed Ben of the rate, $50 per night plus a flat $5 cleaning surcharge, which he happily paid. There were several strict rules to be adhered to, chiefly among them, no illegal drug use or sale, no parties or guests not logged at the front desk, and stay off the 13th floor. The owner apparently lived in the building, and that floor had been converted into his penthouse. Usually the elevator wouldn't allow someone to ride to the 13th floor without a valid keycard, but apparently it had been glitching. Ben listened intently and then said that he understood all the rules. Curtis asked if he needed to be shown his room or needed assistance with his luggage. Ben chuckled a little at this and said no thank you, he could manage. His room on the 10th floor was immaculate. There were no mystery stains or foul odors. On the contrary, it smelled wonderful, welcoming. No visible grime on the forest green walls. There was actual furniture and none of it was broken. It was a bit dated like all the hotel's decor, except for the large flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, but he could hardly complain. He flipped a deadbolt, unpacked his backpack, and headed for the shower, which he desperately needed. As the water washed away almost a week's worth of dirt, his body relaxed the tension that he had been unaware of until it was gone. His mind shifted out of survival mode. The state of near meditation that accompanies a hot shower fell over him for a moment. He was completely at peace. His thoughts were free to wander. At first toward trivial things, the Stephen King book he had been reading. What was on TV tonight? How happy he was that summer was gone, and then for some reason, he had thought of Curtis Burke and the look he had given the dog. In the moment, it seemed like the look of someone who just didn't particularly like dogs, and a normal reaction to a strange one growling directly at you. But thinking back now, it was more akin to the way you might look at a roach or a nasty-looking spider. There'd been something in Burke's eyes, and Ben was sure it was hate. That was strange, but some people really just don't like dogs, and even hate them. Maybe him or a family member were mauled by a dog. There was no real reason it should bother him, but it just didn't feel right. He forced his mind to wander elsewhere, hoping to push away the inexplicable feeling of discomfort and savor the peace a while longer. First came thoughts of Royal, all healed up and freshly groomed. He imagined himself throwing a ball for the dog. Without trying, he realized they were on the lawn in the backyard of a house, a small one, but it looked inviting, like a home. And from out of the sliding glass door stepped his mother. And she looks healthier and happier than he ever remembers her being. She calls to him that dinner is ready. He comes running, Royal hot on his heels. Then he began to cry. After the tears had fallen, he finished up his shower quickly and brushed his teeth. He crawled into bed, and to his pleasant surprise, it was comfortable. The sheets felt clean and not scratchy in the slightest. They even had a faint scent of lavender. He turned on the TV and flipped until he found a channel showing one of the Spider-Man movies. Spidey had been a childhood idol of his, but his mood had soured, and not even the nostalgia brought him joy. He half-watched and wondered where his mother was, until sleep blessedly took him. At 3 a.m., he awakened spontaneously from his sweet, deep slumber. He looked at the clock on the bedside table and was thankful he didn't have to get up for school just yet. His breath puffed out before him in steamy gasps. He was struck by how cold it was. Awareness of where he was had barely dawned on him when he noticed the man standing in the corner of the room, bathed in shadow. The stranger's eyes were fixed on him, predator's eyes that shone in the darkness like terrible fires. The pupils were filled with blood that swirled around impossibly. The gaze bolted him in place, bade him to observe, and he forgot all about the knife on his bedside table. The man smiled, and for a split second, his grin appeared to be all fangs. Ben looked at the door, saw the deadbolt was still securely latched, and determined that, seeing as there was no adjoining room, he must be dreaming. "Ah, you're awake, finally. Good morning, Benjamin." "No, I'm not. This is a dream, a spooky, vivid dream, but still a dream," he told himself. "How would you know my name?" He was mostly asking his subconscious to make it see reason. "I know a lot more than that. I know your father died. I know your mother left you. I know you're a sad, lonely boy." He listed these things like you would the groceries, not even trying to affect sympathy. "I know that you often wonder what's the point, if there even is one. I know about that time on the 6th Street Bridge." "Stop, please." He was almost crying again. Could you cry in a dream? "But I also know you're strong. You've made it farther alone than most. They usually lose their minds or die quickly, with no one to mourn them." His devil's grin widened. "That's not what you want, is it?" No, of course not. I could help you, you know. I have a feeling we're going to be great friends." He took a step closer, glided closer, and Ben recoiled instinctively. "No, you can't. This is just a nightmare, it must be." The stranger threw his head back and laughed at that. A terrible, discordant sound that made the hairs on his neck stand up and his skin crawl. "You are lucky, Benjamin. You just don't know it yet. I see steel in you. I want to see if I can forge a weapon." With that, he was gone. Not in the blink of an eye. His form simply blended out into the shadow and across the walls and floor until it was gradually indistinguishable. Ben awakened in his bed to the lightening of the sky through his window. Everything in the room looked just as it had when he went to bed. His backpack was still at the foot of the bed, undisturbed. He made his way to the bathroom to brush his teeth and saw that the deadbolt was in fact still latched. It was just a dream.